All right, raise your hand if you predicted the Arizona Coyotes, the Nashville Predators, the Philadelphia Flyers, or the Washington Capitals making the 2024 playoffs. Probably not that many of you. Well, anyway, the 2024 playoff race is about to get bananas because there are so many teams, and many of whom we didn't even expect to be in the playoff chase, who are making strong cases as to why they could compete for a spot in the postseason. So that's what this video is all about. We could see as many as 4 or 5 different teams making the playoffs that didn't last year, so there would be more parity than we've seen the past couple of seasons. Anyway, let me know your thoughts. What is your Stanley Cup final matchup at this point, and which team or teams that didn't make the playoffs last year do you expect to get in 2024? Happy New Year to all of you Twisters out there. Really looking forward to putting out all sorts of content for you throughout the season. Also want to extend a special shout out to Michael, who I met at the Shark Tank in that game against the Oilers on December 28th. Thanks so much for coming up to me and for all your support. So what I'm going to do right now is basically determine the teams that I think are locks to make the playoffs at this point, and then we're going to profile all the other teams that are battling it out for just a few more spots in each conference. In the Eastern Conference, with the Atlantic Division, the Bruins have been out in front basically the entire time. At the very least, I don't think they're going to fall out of the top 3. I also think the Florida Panthers are a top 3 lock with that Paul Maurice style of hockey. It's worked going back toward the end of last season and through the postseason. So that means that up for grabs, there's one more top 3 spot in the Atlantic and possibly a wild card. And that's going to be between the Maple Leafs, the Lightning, and the Red Wings. Now, the Canadiens aren't entirely out of the picture. I do think they miss Alex Newhook. The Sabres and the Senators, on the other hand, I just don't see them being able to make up that kind of ground as we see many other teams battling it out for at least a wild card. With the Maple Leafs, of course, we're going to look at the goaltending situation now that Joseph Woll is injured and also Ilya Samsonov has been placed on waivers. Do they trade for a goaltender? That is certainly one thing we're going to look out for, not just at the trade deadline, but as soon as right now. Even that aside, I do think it'd be very uncharacteristic for the Leafs to fall out of a top 3 spot. They still have a bit of a cushion when you look at points percentage, but what jumps out at me is that the Leafs are just 10-10 in regulation. So overall, they've only won 17 of 34 games so far, and the teams below them aren't much worse than that. The Lightning are 18-5-5. They've been sort of weathering the storm with Andrei Vasilevsky out for a while, but since he's come back, they haven't been all that much better. I mean, Nikita Kucherov is having himself an MVP caliber season, but even so, the Lightning haven't been able to keep the puck out of their net on a consistent enough basis for them to be a lock to get back into the postseason. I do find that surprising. And as for the Detroit Red Wings, this has happened in previous years, the past couple, where they've started the season strong and then they start falling back in the standings. They're just 3-7 in their past 10 games, and they've also had some injuries to their goaltending. They've already used 4 goalies so far this season. Husso hasn't been the answer for them. Reimer has kind of fallen back down to earth, so they need one of those goaltenders to at least step up to give them somewhat more stable goaltending if they want to stay in the playoff picture. Then we get to the Metropolitan Division, and the Rangers have been just the class of the Metro since the very beginning of the season. Peter Laviolette should be a front runner for Coach of the Year. Then you have a 6-team logjam where 4 points separate 6 teams, and when you look at points percentage, it's even closer than that. So we've got the Philadelphia Flyers, the New York Islanders, the Carolina Hurricanes, Washington Capitals, New Jersey Devils, and Pittsburgh Penguins. Now, as many as 4 of those teams could actually qualify for the playoffs, but certainly we're seeing teams here that we didn't expect whatsoever. So let's start with the Philadelphia Flyers. John Tortorella, another potential Coach of the Year finalist. They haven't been as hot recently, but they have beaten several playoff caliber teams over the past month. They're 8th in goals against at 2.72 per game, and both goaltenders have played pretty well in their roles. The one thing is that they don't have anybody averaging a point per game. Travis Konechny is the closest to that, but when you have a group that's reliable in its own zone, really look at what Tortorella did with the Columbus Blue Jackets. They weren't exactly world beaters offensively, and they had their best seasons as a franchise with him behind the bench. Now let's touch on the New York Islanders, and earlier in the season, there were fans who were calling for Lane Lambert's head. They're getting enough offense from the top producers, and the power play has actually improved a lot for this club. They're surrendering the 2nd most shots per game, which is very surprising for the Islanders, as defensively committed as they've been the past couple of seasons. But the silver lining here is that they have 2 great goaltenders, so they don't have to have Sorokin starting 65 games just to get them into the playoffs. Semyon Varlamov has been once again more than capable and playing some of the best hockey of his career in New York. Our next team is the Carolina Hurricanes, and going into this year, a lot of us out there thought that they had the best defensive core in the NHL, at least top 3. It didn't look like that early on. It's gotten a lot tighter in the recent weeks. Now, the goaltending definitely set this team back a little bit, with Antti Ranta not playing up to par with Freddie Anderson's injury. Pyotr Kochetkov didn't have a good start to the season, but recently he has come in and has been an absolute stud for them between the pipes. In his last 8 games, he has a .930 save percentage and is surrendering just 2 goals a game. And offensively, this team has been able to get it done mostly by committee, as the Carolina Hurricanes that we know. Actually, their power play has been a bright spot for them this season, and Sebastian Aho has been an absolute dynamo out there, and that's coming after he signed his long-term extension, so that contract is already more than justified in the early years of his deal. Then we get to the Washington Capitals. Now, they were as high as second in the standings. They have fallen back a little bit recently. They're just 6-4 in their last 16 games. They've been hit with significant injuries all season long. Of course, the long-term injuries to Backstrom, Pacioretty, TJ Oshie's on injured reserve, so is Sonny Milano. And really, offensively, they haven't had that many weapons to rely on, with Alex Ovechkin at just 7 goals so far this season. And overall, the offense is second worst in the NHL, and they have the 3rd worst power play. If you could really chalk it up to one reason why this team is still in it, it's got to be Charlie Lindgren. Darcy Kemper hasn't been holding his own as the number 1, but Lindgren has come in kind of like Chekhov and has largely stood on his head for this club. Then we get to the New Jersey Devils, kind of a sexy pick to maybe even win the Stanley Cup this season, with a young team and some savvy veterans on that club. They are 10-5-1 in their past 16 games, so they have been turning it on better. However, in 7 of those games, they've surrendered at least 4 goals. Not the greatest formula for success, but they have so many different offensive weapons. But rather than just getting into the playoffs, I think that if they want to finish in a top 3 spot, they're going to need to see more from 2 players, Timo Meier and Andre Palat. And I understand the Devils are doing this with Dougie Hamilton on injured reserve. And the last team I'll talk about in the Metro are the Pittsburgh Penguins. So they're 6-1-1 in their last 8 games, and in 6 of those 8 games, they've scored at least 4 goals. And they've been doing this recently without Brian Rust. However, he's been practicing with the team. He'll be back soon. Ricard Raquel has come back in recent weeks. Hopefully he can kind of regain that scoring pace that he was on last season, because then this team could very well stay alive in the playoff race. So overall, with the Eastern Conference, the way I look at this, there are 3 locks for the playoffs right now. New York Rangers in the Metro, and then in the Atlantic, you have the Boston Bruins and the Florida Panthers. So in other words, you have 9 teams battling it out for 5 spots. Then we get to the Western Conference, and the way I see this, you have a top 3 in each division that I think is pretty set. I don't see this changing the rest of the way. In the Central, you have the Winnipeg Jets, who, look at the end of last season, how the postseason ended, right? With the trades that had been swirling. I know they dumped Dubois, but we had talked about maybe Mark Scheifele or Connor Hellebuck being on the block. What about, Cheveldayoff's job? What about Rick Bonus's job? And here they are, and they've been consistently playing some of the best hockey in that conference. Dallas Stars and Colorado Avalanche, I think, are locks for the top 3 no matter what. That's what we expected going into this season. And then in the Pacific, you've got the LA Kings with a juggernaut offense. You've got the Vancouver Canucks with elite playmakers at all positions for that team. Demko could certainly be in that Vezina Trophy conversation. And the defending champion Golden Knights, they have sort of slowed down recently. Injuries in goal have certainly been a piece of that, but I'm not overly concerned about that team based on how they play hockey and how they're coached by Bruce Cassidy. So my outlook on the conference is that we have 2 wildcard spots open, and we have 5 to 7 other teams battling for those 2 spots. So we're going to do this by points percentage. Let's start with the Arizona Coyotes. Now, they have 7 players with at least 20 points in 35 games. That's really good. It's not just Clayton Keller that they're relying on. They have surprisingly good depth. The drawback with Arizona is that they've recently been pretty streaky. So they've lost 3, they've won 5, they lost 4, and then they won 4. This is a young team, so I expect some inconsistency there. But when we look at some of these other teams, they've been more steady over the past several weeks. One such team are the Nashville Predators. So no Matt Duchene, no Ryan Johansson, no Matthias Ekholm, no problem for Andrew Brunette's group. Who knows, maybe he'll be in the Coach of the Year conversation. The team started just 5-10. I get it, it's a new coach, new system, all that. But since then, they're 14-6-1. Then we get to the Edmonton Oilers, and yeah, we're talking about a very fast turnaround under new coach Chris Knobloch. They're 15-6. That's one of the best records in the NHL since Woodcroft was fired. And in their last 16 games, there have only been 3 times when they gave up 4 goals or more. That means a lot for the Edmonton Oilers, a team that has structurally just been horrible defensively, and in goal, they've been very unreliable. But Stuart Skinner has certainly turned it on. I actually got to see him get a shutout against the Sharks recently. I know that that's not the most impressive of feats, but he looked very steady back there. And they're also conceding the 4th fewest shots per game. That makes a huge difference for those goaltenders. So this team is definitely trending in the right direction. It's no fluke. Then we get to the St. Louis Blues. Now, they've only played 8 games with new coach Drew Bannister after Craig Berube was fired. They're 5-3. A huge reason why we're still talking about the Blues at this point is Joel Hofer. I did talk about him in my season preview as a potential difference maker, and he certainly lived up to that. In 14 games, he has a .911 save percentage and a 2.76 goals against average. But I do think that this team needs more punch in that middle six. They could use a little bit more even out of Jordan Kyrou, who has that potential to score 35 plus goals for this team. And it's crazy that they're all the way down in 7th, but there are good talking points for the next team, and that's the Minnesota Wild. Ever since John Hines relieved Dean Evason, the team is 11-5. And one of the big beneficiaries for this club in those 16 games is Philip Gustafsson. He's played in 11 of those games, and he has a .927 save percentage, and he's surrendering just 2 goals per game, so looking more like the Gustafsson that we saw last year. Now, several significant players for the Wild have been out recently due to injury, but there are 2 players who have kind of come out of nowhere and pleasantly been a surprise getting on the board. You have Marco Rossi, first full season in the NHL, and playing that second line center. That's a big deal for a club that is kind of thin at that position. He has 11 goals and 11 assists. And then you have Marcus Johansson with 11 goals and 10 assists in a surprising resurgence for him. Now, there are 2 more teams that I also want to include in the mix here. The first is the Seattle Kraken because they are at NHL 500. However, they've only won 14 of their 37 games going into the Winter Classic. They've won 4 in a row. Matty Beniers has been kind of an offensive disappointment. He's regressed. He only has 5 goals and 13 assists. They can still get their scoring done by committee, but overall they have regressed a little bit offensively. This was a team that could just absolutely score in droves with just about all 4 lines, but we're not seeing that this year so far. Joey Daccord has been amazing in 22 games, a .915 save percentage, a 2.46 goals against average, over 7 saved above expected, so they have to ride him if they want to stay alive in the playoff race. And the Flames aren't that far behind the Kraken, but I really don't see them staying alive in the playoff race for all that long. According to Hockey Reference, though, they've played the 2nd hardest schedule in the NHL so far, and yet I look at it this way: Blake Coleman leads the team in scoring. And the last point I want to explore here is regulation record. I know that doesn't mean so much when it comes to actually making the postseason, but when you look at the top teams in their division, there's a correlation between strong play and regulation and staying at the top of the standings. So take a look at this. These are the teams that are at least 3 games over 500 in regulation. The best in the East is the Boston Bruins at 18-7. No surprise, they're at the top of the Atlantic Division. The New York Rangers are 20-9. The Panthers are 20-12. A little bit further down in that sort of wild card chase, or 3rd in their division chase, you have the New York Islanders at 13-10, and you have the Carolina Hurricanes at 16-13. And in the Western Conference, no surprise, it's the top 3 teams in each conference, and by a very wide margin. So the Kings 18-8, the Jets are 20-9, Canucks at 22-10, Avalanche at 22-11, Stars at 15-9, and Golden Knights at 16-10. Anyway, guys, let me know your thoughts in the comments. Which teams who didn't make the playoffs last year will make it this year, and what is your Stanley Cup final matchup at this point? Comment down below and stick around for more content throughout the season. We're going to be covering the trade deadline and other high points this year. It's going to be a great year here on Twisted Wrister Hockey. Really looking forward to interacting with you Twisters for all of 2024. So leave a thumbs up, stick around for more content, subscribe if you're new here and want more stuff like this, and I'll see you around for the next one.